something going on. I'm just not sure what it is. Good morning. Today's hearing is called to order. This morning we're here to discuss an issue I feel very passionate about, and hopefully others here today as well, and that's protecting our election systems. For the past 2 years, I've done my best with others to sound the alarm about the vulnerabilities of our election system. We know that in the lead up to 2016 elections, the Russians targeted at least 21 state election systems. We also know, through confirmation of all 17 intel agencies, that Russia successfully hacked our democratic process to encourage voters to elect the president. But it didn't stop in 2016. The Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, warns us that lights were still blinking red. And sure enough, in 2018, the intel community saw similar attempts by Russia and other foreign countries, including China and Iran, to influence our election process and promote their strategic interest. We can be sure that they intend to interfere in the 2020 presidential election. Yet, many of the vulnerabilities that existed in 2016 continue to persist across the country. Our election infrastructure remains outdated, low-tech, and nowhere near where it needs to be to prevent future intrusions. In the 2018 elections, 41 states used voting machines that were over a decade old and susceptible to cyber intrusions and system crashes. 13 states used voting machines that failed to produce a paper ballot or record, leaving them unable to conduct meaningful post-election audits. 34 states used electronic poll boxes in at least some polling locations, including 6 states that use them statewide, which are vulnerable to hackers who can alter or delete voter registration data. Some of these states are taking steps to replace their outdated systems, but they lack the necessary tools and funding. We need to give state and local election officials the tools they need to adequately defend the security of our election system. After an 8-year gap in federal funding, the fiscal year 2018 Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Act included $380 million for grants to help states fortify and protect election systems. And we saw an overwhelming demand for assistance. Every single state and eligible territory requested grant funding, and the Election Assistance Commission, EAC, has dispersed every single dollar of the $380 million. The EAC is still analyzing how much money the states spent in the first 9 months, but based on initial plans submitted by the states, we know the states plan to spend more than 1/3 of the grant funding on cybersecurity efforts, and more than 1/4 of the funding was tagged to buy new voting equipment. While a critical first step, it is important to emphasize that this funding was just a down payment. It represents only a fraction of the total need across the country to replace outdated voting equipment and implement cybersecurity and other protections at the state and local level to ensure our election system can withstand future attempts of foreign interference. The last time our electoral process was put into question, post-Bush-Gore, this government spent over $3.5 billion to upgrade our election systems because we treasure the integrity of our democracy. I know we still do. I look forward to hearing from our panel of expert witnesses this morning who can help us understand the challenges and threats we face and what steps we should be taking to address them. Before I turn to our witnesses for their statements, I would like to recognize Ranking Member Mr. Graves for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you today. Look, when we show up to vote on Election Day, Mr. Chairman, I think we both can agree that we should have the confidence and a guarantee that our votes and our voices are going to be heard. That means that a fair count by local officials and volunteers and an election that is free from outside influences that aim to harm our systems. Maintaining the integrity of our country's elections is fundamental to our democracy. We should all be on the side of secure elections. This is not a partisan issue in any way whatsoever, and I appreciate the chairman holding this hearing today. I think it's a really important topic for us to discuss. Now, there are many aspects to election security, such as voter registration systems, voting machines themselves, absentee balloting, and ensuring that our polling places are safe. In fact, earlier this month, I was pleased that the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of National Intelligence, and the Department of Justice shared that there were no material impact of foreign interference in our nation's elections infrastructure in the most recent election, 2018 midterm elections. And now this is a significant accomplishment. General Nakasone, the commander of Cyber Command and the director of National Security Agency, recently testified about efforts to defend the integrity of our midterm elections. Cyber Command created a persistent presence in cyberspace to monitor and to disrupt adversaries. They shared information through DHS with state elections officials to help identify weak spots in our system and to improve the threat warning. I hope these partnerships between the federal government and the state and local elections officials continue to grow. But it's important that we leave election administering and oversight responsibilities to the states. What I don't want to see from this committee or from Congress with all of us here is that there's a heavy hand of federal government that is dictating to state and local officials how to administer their own elections or what equipment should be used. Nor do I want to see the federal government be the responsible party for funding states' elections. That is a role and a responsibility of the state governments to fund the cost of voting machines and their administering of their own elections. Mr. Chairman, again, thanks for holding this hearing. I think it's an important topic and look forward to a robust discussion today.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Well, let me now introduce our distinguished panel that is here this morning. The Honorable Eric Rosenbach is the co-director of the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Mr. Rosenbach previously served as the Chief of Staff for the Pentagon from 2015 to 2017, and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Security, where he was responsible for leading all aspects of the department's cyber strategy, policy, and operations. Dr. J. Alex Halderman is a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan and director of Michigan Center for Computer Security and Society. He conducts research on computer security and privacy with an emphasis on problems that broadly impact society and public policy, including electronic voting, and has conducted multiple demonstrations on the vulnerability of these systems to hacking. Mr. Steven Sandvoss is the executive director of the Illinois State Board of Elections, where he has served in that capacity since 2015. He has been with the State Board of Elections for more than 30 years, so he brings a wealth of firsthand experience to his testimony today. I want to thank you all for being here today and look forward to your testimony. Without objection, your written statements will be entered into the record. With that in mind, we would like to ask you to please summarize your opening statement in 3 minutes. Mr. Rosenbach, you're now recognized for 3 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves, for the invitation to join your subcommittee today. It's an honor to be here to speak with you about our nation's cybersecurity and the integrity of our election systems. Also, I'd like to thank you for your service and thank you for being with such good witnesses. Mr. Sandvoss, in particular, state election officials are on the front lines of defending democracy, and it's been a pleasure to work with them over the past several years. Imagine, if you can, that we discovered during the Cold War that Soviet intelligence operatives had gained access to polling places and vote counting machines and attempted to change the outcome of our nation's election. Imagine if Soviet spies had infiltrated our nation's newspapers and television stations and tricked them into publishing false content and divided Americans and inflamed political tensions. Would President Reagan have stood by and debated the threat, or would he have acted? This should not be a partisan issue. As Congressman Graves said, our democracy has been attacked and continues to be attacked. Now is the time for the country to unify and come together and act, not after we watch the Russians or the Iranians or the North Koreans try to disrupt the 2020 presidential election. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the Worldwide Threat Assessment highlighted the persistent threat of foreign interference in the elections in 2020. The assessment assures us, and I agree, that our adversaries are already planning how to disrupt the 2020 elections. With this in mind, I have 3 areas in which I believe Congress should focus, and of the 3, I'll focus on the first: bolstering domestic defenses and resilience, developing precise and legal offensive cyber operations, and adopting a clear public deterrence posture. First, Congress should authorize an appropriate regular, ongoing federal funding focused on improving the security of our elections. The $380 million approved by Congress last year was an extremely important first step. However, the states need a dependable source of funding to support the cybersecurity and upkeep of paper-backed electronic voting systems. Should be very flexible, but tied to the NIST framework. Second, Congress should pass a comprehensive privacy regulation law. that protects Americans' personal data and information from abuse both by leading tech firms and nation-state intelligence organizations from Russia and China. Finally, Congress should also immediately pass regulation to ensure that online platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are not used as tools of foreign influence. Let's be honest, Facebook's disregard for America's privacy represents a significant national security vulnerability to our democracy. If they won't act, you must. Finally, the two other areas in which I think you should devote your attention are on developing precise legal options. As Congressman Graves mentioned, Cybercom, in particular, if you read the Washington Post yesterday, has started a more aggressive posture, which I believe is very important. We can't sit back and just take blows. Finally, the country needs a clear deterrent posture that shows our adversaries that we won't just be on the receiving end of these attacks, that we'll be more assertive, and that we'll unify as a country. Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenbach. You seem to have a very attentive fan in the audience. Dr. Haldeman.
Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves, and distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to address this urgent matter of national security. 3 years ago, America's election infrastructure was attacked. Hackers targeted voter registration systems, and in some states, had the ability to destroy registration data, which would have caused chaos at the polls. We were spared only because attackers chose not to pull the trigger. Next time, things could be much worse, because America's voting machines remain stunningly vulnerable. I and other computer scientists have found numerous ways that hackers could sabotage machines and alter election results, and sophisticated hackers can penetrate them even though they aren't directly connected to the internet. Last fall, Chairman Quigley and Representative Katko invited me to demonstrate a hack here on Capitol Hill in a mock election with a voting machine used in 18 states. I remotely hacked in, stole both congressmen's votes, and changed who won. These capabilities are certainly within reach for America's enemies. Fortunately, we know how to better defend elections. Paper ballots, manual risk-limiting audits, and cybersecurity best practices are a prescription endorsed by the overwhelming majority of cybersecurity experts and by the national academies, and favored by a majority of election officials. Most states have started implementing these defenses using the $380 million that Congress appropriated last spring. But many are still struggling to afford replacing their vulnerable machines. For example, Georgia voted in November using the same machine that I hacked in front of Chairman Quigley, but it received only a tiny fraction of the cost to replace them. 43 states use machines that are no longer manufactured, and 12 states use paperless machines, which are impossible to secure. This puts the entire nation at risk. States and local governments need further federal assistance before attackers strike again. The highest priority should be to eliminate paperless voting and deploy hand-marked paper ballots, optical scanners, and assistive devices for the disabled. If provided under the Help America Vote Act, about $900 million is needed to ensure that all states receive at least half the necessary funds. States need this money now, even before stronger equipment standards are in place, but Congress can at least prohibit purchasing new machines that lack a robustly auditable paper ballot. With your leadership, elections in 2020 and beyond can be well secured, and voters will have good reason for confidence. But if we delay, I fear it's only a matter of time until an election is disrupted or stolen in a cyber attack. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Sandvoss.
Good morning. My name is Steve Sandvoss, and I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois State Board of Elections. I would like to thank Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves, and the distinguished members of the committee for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. As noted by Chairman Quigley and my colleague Dr. Haldeman, in June of 2016, the Illinois State Board of Elections was the victim of a cyber attack during which hackers gained unauthorized access into the voter registration database maintained by the State Board of Elections. In response to this attack, measures were immediately undertaken to eliminate the vulnerability, assess the damage, alert the victims, and beef up our own cyber defenses. Following this, the State Board of Elections undertook an unprecedented effort to secure its voter registration database, as well as other IT-related applications. These efforts were assisted by the $380 million grant to the states by the EAC, of which Illinois received $13.2 million. Legislation was then passed in Illinois requiring the state to create a Cyber Navigator program. The Cyber Navigator program is a program that is required for the jurisdictions to participate in if they are to receive any federal money. The first part of the program is the Illinois Century Network, which is a state-managed network delivering network services to government agencies in Illinois. The goal of the network is to provide the election authorities with a cleaner and safer internet, and isolating this network to one under the complete control of the SBE and the Department of Innovation and Technology ensures that voter registration data and election authority management operations never actually flow over the internet. Additionally, this gives us the ability to provide additional security measures and monitoring. The second part is the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Program, which in the SBE is overseeing partnership with the Statewide Terrorism and Intelligence Center. The program involves the research and gathering of information related to cyber attacks and cyber resiliency, and sharing that information with all federal and state stakeholders. Our goal is to consolidate numerous information sources and, with feedback from the election authorities, distill it into the most valuable, actionable information possible. The third element is cyber navigators themselves. 9 cyber navigators are currently on contract to assist the election authorities by performing on-site risk assessments and providing resources to ensure election security for 2020 and beyond. The navigators will be offering additional services such as phishing assessments, penetration testing, and educational trainings. They will also be performing additional risk assessments on physical security and best practices in securing voting equipment. In addition to the Cyber Navigator program, the State Board of Elections worked in partnership with the Illinois National Guard cybersecurity team to provide cyber protection for both the State Board of Elections and the election authorities during the 2018 general election. Members of the Guard were stationed in all regions of the state, at the SBE office, at the Statewide Terrorism Information Center, and at their own bases to be ready in the event of a cyber attack. Looking to the future, the State Board believes it is necessary to maintain this program indefinitely and to expand it to address the continuing needs of the election authorities. And in addition, as Dr. Halderman noted, the voting systems in the state are ancient, they're outdated, need to be replaced. And that would, of course, entail funds to do so. Those are the goals of the immediate goals of the State Board of Elections and the election community in Illinois. I thank you for your time and allowing me to speak before you, and I will be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you all. Gentlemen, let me ask you as succinctly as you can. We have to prioritize. Mr. Graves is fond of, and he is accurate in saying, we don't have unlimited resources here, but we want to prioritize the needs that are out there to protect our election security. So I understand we're talking about training, we're talking about new equipment, we're talking about software. What exactly, if you could divide your time, do the states need, and try to, if you could prioritize that to the extent possible, beginning with you, Mr. Sandvoss?
Certainly. I think if you were to ask the folks in Illinois who actually run the elections, I think they would all say that replacing the voting equipment is probably their #1 concern and their most immediate need. Unfortunately, they all recognize that with current budget situation, that money is probably not going to be forthcoming anytime soon.
What is it going to cost? We could extrapolate out for states with equal different populations. If you're going to replace all the equipment that needs it in Illinois, what would it cost?
I've been told roughly $175 million. Million.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Those machines are expensive, they're not that expensive. But the other immediate need, and I think this is more from our standpoint, is cybersecurity. And I think with the Cyber Navigator program, we're going in the right direction with it. The tough part right now is getting all the election authorities to understand the threat, and I think most of them do. But again, it's a work in progress, but once we get them all participating in the program, then the next step is assessing their vulnerabilities, which is, again, a project of the Cyber Navigators, which they're doing as we speak. But once they come up with their assessments, my suspicion is that most of the jurisdictions in the state are going to need extensive improvements to their cyber posture, and that's going to cost money.
And the training that goes with it.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, let me move on. Dr. Haldeman?
Thank you. I think the most important priority is to make sure we have paper ballots and strong audits in all states. But the biggest impediment to that is states that still have aging equipment, either that doesn't have paper ballots at all or that is very difficult to audit because of the way it's designed.
And is there a problem with the older equipment not being able to handle anti-hacking software?
Older equipment in general doesn't benefit from the last decade or two of security improvements. Things have gotten better in security in general, but we still don't know how to make a machine that's absolutely hack-proof. That's why we need this other layer of defense that comes from having a paper trail, paper ballots, and going back and spot checking them to make sure the result is right.
Now, you talked about hacking an individual voting machine. Now, there's a distinction Mr. Sandvoss and the state has talked to me about, and that is there are states that electronically communicate results. The machines are connected to the internet, and I don't believe that's true in Illinois. Is that correct?
Machines?
Right.
Machines themselves are not connected to the internet, no.
But there are states that have that, correct?
There are states that transmit results back over wireless links or over cellular modems that can go over the internet, but the bigger vulnerability, as I see it, is what happens before each election, when the machines have to be programmed with the ballot design from a centralized system.
I see. Okay. Let me move on if I could.
Yes, sir. You said to prioritize. If you're going to prioritize, there's no way all of the technology catches up by 2020, which means from my perspective, you have to focus on training and exercising to do holistic risk mitigation. So up at the Kennedy School, we've had state election officials several times come for Army-style training exercises in which we put them through an attack, have them respond, try to figure out how they can mitigate risk and do all of those things.
How does this work? Putting this in perspective, there are, I've been told, 10,000 entities that are involved in a federal election.
Yes.
Do we have the capabilities, as you say, the military-type training, to have those folks train all the way down the line?
Sure. It's a big challenge, but not as big a challenge as trying to completely replace technical infrastructure, and so you train the trainer. We have a training manual. We bring in people from states. They go back to the state. They run the exercise, train people how to do the exercise. It's not perfect. It's certainly not the silver bullet, but we're just trying to do something that can have the most immediate impact on trying to mitigate the threat, which remember also is about info ops. There's a lot. Yes, sir.
And I do want to, and we'll be equally fair with the ranking member in time, but what concerns me is that we sometimes forget that operating elections smoothly doesn't just involve the hostile actors. The fact is, we had recounts that in states this time out that weren't allowed to finish because the election equipment was broken.
Sure.
So the whole democratic process, even if you don't have the problem of hostile actors, often hinges in trying to find out who really won an election with how old this equipment is.
Sir, I totally agree.
Thank you. Mr. Graves?
Hey, Mr. Chairman, let's get back to the topic here. I think we all have concerns about election outcomes and results, and even outside of elections, I think we all have concerns about cyber vulnerabilities. There's no question about that, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rosenbach, are you aware of any impact or a change of an election result from the 2016 or 18 elections that were a result of any kind of cyber attack?
No, sir.
And so as we have this conversation, let's just all know that there has been no altering of an election outcome. There's no evidence of that. And Mr. Chairman, I know you're part of another committee that's gone in great detail and depth on this topic. But I think the broader conversation is, do we as a committee step in where states need and provide states and tell states how to spend their money and provide them money? Or do we provide them guidance and good counsel and training? I think that's sort of where we are. So we're at the end of an authorization period where it was just about $4 billion was funded 10 years ago, or authorized. We just finished the $380 million funding it to the states. To the question about Illinois and their election systems and the cost, you're spot on, $175 million, because in fact, yesterday, Georgia just passed a budget that included $150 million of state dollars to change out and upgrade elections equipment. So states can do it, Mr. Chairman, and I'm proud that Mr. Bishop and I can come from a state that's willing to step up and do that. But as we look ahead, I guess the question I have for everybody here is, what is the role of the federal government in this? Are we to spend another $4 billion to get 10 years down the road to find out that we modernize things that we want to unmodernize again? I mean, that's where we are. It's sort of funny to hear this conversation that we want to go back to the way things used to be because we spent a lot of money to get things in a spot to where we think there might be a problem, but there has been no problems. But so I'll leave it with each of you on that, and we can just start on the table. And I appreciate your three-prong approach there on addressing some of those problems, too.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So the first point is, and the role of the government, like I mentioned, is to defend the nation. That's why it's not fair to state and local election officials that they're there just taking the punches from the Russian intelligence service and the GRU. That means Cybercom needs to do something more proactive, as I believe they have been. We didn't do that during the Obama administration. That was a mistake. Second of all, I do think it's important for there to be federal funding for the states because this is a nation-state actor. The states are not designed to have cybersecurity to defend against that threat. It seems fair, with that in mind, that you give them extra support for cybersecurity type of defenses. Sir, I agree with
For
you
new
that,
equipment or just for assistance, training, protection, defense, those kind of things?
honestly, I would leave that to the states. You're right, it should be the states. Let them decide. There can be a general framework, but the states should decide what they need most, but they do need a little help for defending themselves.
As does the rest of the country, and all entities need that same cyber protection.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's right, exactly. And then just the last point is that, I'll leave it there. I don't want to use too much time.
The role of government in elections, I think, is one of providing for the common defense. The problem we have here is that from an attacker's perspective, they don't necessarily care what state they're going to strike in, so long as it's one that's going to be able to cause a difference in a national election outcome or undermine confidence in a national outcome. And therefore, until we bring up the most weakly protected states to an adequate level of security, the whole nation is going to be at risk.
What is the most weakest state
I-
in your mind?
I-
Because right now we've heard there is no evidence of an election result being changed or altered as a result of outside influences of a cyber attack.
We've been very lucky that our adversaries haven't pulled the trigger. And I think it's excellent that Georgia is making progress towards replacing its systems. Georgia has in the past been among the most vulnerable states. But there's still about 11 states that do not have an auditable, robust paper trail in place so that if something happens to the machines, we can go back and check. And I think that's the
Nothing's
most persistent
preventing them from
vulnerability
changing
now.
to a system. So maybe it's that Congress should require some sort of auditing, and I think this goes back to your points. You had 3 points, that some sort of system that shows that there's an audit trail or a way to account for election results. Is that what you're suggesting?
Congressman, I think it would be excellent if we had a uniform national policy that elections should be rigorously audited. But I think that having an unfunded mandate that states purchase perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars in new equipment in order to comply with that is going to create problems for many states that are struggling to find the money.
Mr. Cartwright? I'm sorry.
Gentleman from Illinois might want to answer.
Okay, I'll be brief. I just wanted to echo Mr. Rosenbach's thoughts on the role of the federal government in defending against these types of attacks. When I was on 60 Minutes, I was asked whether I thought it was a fair fight, Illinois versus the Russians, and especially an agency as small as ours, and I said it was basically bows and arrows against the lightning. We have a good IT department, and our resources have been well spent, but the fact is it's just not enough. And I think that with adequate funding, we can secure our elections even more, and I think it's vital that we do so, and letting the states be the primary driver as to where that money goes, I think is the most prudent approach. Thank you.
Can I just have one quick follow-up? Because I know we're talking about elections, and I know you're specifically talking about voter registration files, and that's something we should all be concerned about. But is the state of Illinois under cyber threats in any other aspect, any other citizen information that might be at risk, any tax information, because I know we're talking about voter, but it should be a broader context, right? And I don't hear that the state is asking for federal assistance to protect all the other files as well.
We're not aware of any specific systems that are currently under attack. I think it's more the unknown is what we're afraid of. I mean, we weren't expecting a penetration into our voter database, and hopefully it won't happen again. But you're right. There's other systems out there that could very well be vulnerable, and I think it's our job to see that those are secured as well.
The gentleman's not suggesting that if they had hacked into the Medicaid files for the state of Illinois and done it in dozens of states, that the states wouldn't be asking for help from the feds. Well, it would, again, just appreciate the level of sophistication at some of the state, local level in protecting these vital lists. This isn't just elections. I do think it is a new world with nation-state attackers attacking the local levels. But I appreciate that. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing today. Dr. Halderman, I come from Pennsylvania, where to this day 83% of voters are using the paperless direct recording electronic voting systems, or DREs, direct recording electronic voting systems. These machines have been called a clear and present danger by the Blue Ribbon Commission on Pennsylvania's election security, as well as other experts in the field. Now, as you noted in your testimony, this is a matter of the highest priority, these unauditable election machines. You said there is a plan to move to paper ballots, but that the costs have slowed the process. I looked at some of your research, and I found, dating back even to 2011, you found similar types of paperless voting machines used in India as particularly vulnerable to hacking. And as you said, you've actually come here and demonstrated personally how to hack these machines. Here's my question. In lay terms, can you walk us through, first, what is it that makes DREs particularly vulnerable? And then secondly, what are the steps somebody or a state actor would follow if they were intent on manipulating election results calculated by DREs, and how easy or difficult this might be to achieve?
I'd be happy to, Congressman Cartwright, and I myself grew up in Pennsylvania, so...
I knew I liked you, despite the Michigan pedigree.
All right, so DREs are particularly vulnerable because, well, like other kinds of voting machines, they are computers. And so they are based on software and hardware that could potentially be compromised in many different ways. They're actually much more complex computers than they look like. You'd think they're just a simple touchscreen, but it could be a million lines of computer software that's powering those machines in the back office systems. I've studied DREs, including DREs used in Pennsylvania, since 2006. And for every machine that I've looked at, there have been ways that an attacker could craft malicious software, spread it into the machines, and use that to subvert all of the digital records of the vote the machine stores. And with a DRE, the entire record, or at least the primary record of the ballot, is simply a file in a computer's memory. So if an attacker can tamper with the software, they can change that file, they can change all the records of the vote, and make the machine produce whatever totals the attacker wants. And it's not just attacking a single machine in isolation. Before every election, the DREs have to be programmed with the ballot design, the rules for counting, et cetera. And that's produced on a back office system somewhere by the election vendor or by the county or the state. If an attacker can hack into those back office systems, they can spread malicious software to all the DREs programmed from them. And in the most concentrated, centralized case, there's one vendor that programs DREs in 2,000 jurisdictions across 34 states from a central facility. So that's the risk, that an attacker can get into these systems, compromise voting machines on a massive scale, and just disrupt elections or even change results, potentially on a wide enough scale to affect a national result.
On staying with the paper trail issue for the moment, do you think that all voting machines having a verifiable paper trail is enough of a solution to the scenario you just described, or is there more that Congress, states, or local election officials could or should be doing right now to make sure this never happens?
Well, briefly, it's not enough just to have a paper trail. We also need to make sure that voters are checking that paper trail to make sure it's right, and that election officials are auditing that paper trail to a high enough level of confidence that we know the election outcome produced by the computers isn't fraudulent.
If you were advising the state of Pennsylvania on what to do today to make our election process more secure, what are the top 3 things you would recommend be done immediately to ensure the confidence in our elections?
I'd recommend that Pennsylvania, as soon as possible, replace its out-of-date and paperless machines with paper ballots and optical scanners, and that Pennsylvania implement what are called risk-limiting audits, which are a random sample-based test at the end of the election where officials look at enough of the ballots to know that the computer results are right. Then further improvements to cybersecurity best practices of the form of things like training, better testing of equipment, et cetera, would go the rest of the way to ensuring that elections can't be sabotaged and results can't be disrupted or changed.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart.
Thank you, Chairman, and to the witnesses. It's been very informative so far. And I'm going to hit on some things really quickly and kind of go down the line here if I could. And Mr. Sandvoss, I want to start with you. And this is a tiny, well, not a tiny thing, but it's a small thing. But sometimes I think we hear things in here that perhaps witnesses say, well, I didn't say that exactly the way I meant because there's a written record. I want to ask you, and I think you might clarify, you said you're not aware of other systems under attack. We know that they are, and you surely know they are. I just want to give you a chance to say, yeah, it's not just electoral processor systems under attack. Virtually everything's under attack by some type of cyber warfare. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
Yeah.
I would.
Okay.
And I didn't mean to suggest that all the systems are secured and impregnable.
And I knew you didn't. That's why I wanted to give you a chance to add some clarity to that part of our conversation. I was in Moscow in 2016, just for the election. I came home and I said, they're going to mess with our elections. I did dozens of interviews. No one really cared. They genuinely didn't care. But I was often asked, well, what are they trying to do? You know, do they favor one candidate? Do they want to? And I said, what they want to do is break down our faith in institutions. They want to break down our faith in democracy. And there's no more greater catastrophe that we could endure than if people actually believed, for legitimate reasons, that an election, a national election, had been stolen, and that it had been in some way altered by some foreign entity. And whoever put this together at FSB or what other intelligence organization in Russia, the dude surely got a promotion out of this, because I think it exceeded their wildest expectations. I don't think they thought that we would be talking about this 3 years later and on. Mr. Quigley and I both sit on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. We looked at this deeply. We had, about a year ago, a list of recommendations that I have 22 of them here that I'm going to refer to in just a moment that deal with this. It's something that I think all of us take seriously. So I want to, again, go very quickly. And for clarity, I want to hit this and allow all of you to have a chance to answer, because Mr. Robach, you have, but others haven't. I want us to assure the American people this one thing. This is an enormous problem. We have to be aggressive in dealing with it. But I also want them to understand, because some of them don't, that we don't have evidence of them altering the outcome of any election. And I want you to say yes or no, you agree with that. Mr. Rosenbach, you already have. You said you agree with that. Mr. Halderman?
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay, and Mr. Sanders?
I also agree with that. yes.
Okay, thank you. It's just for clarity. One other thing that I think is important for people to recognize, this isn't new. This didn't just start in 2016 or 2018. We have examples of, for example, Russia interfering with the Ukrainian election, where they actually had a news release predicting the outcome because they manipulated the numbers and then they were able to stop it. And I think it's, again, important for us to see this isn't something that was just created. In fact, at the fall of the Berlin Wall, Russia people looked at us as these, Americans could be our friends, but I don't think Russian leaders did. I think they always kept the hybrid warfare and all of the options on the table, and they were active in that. So then, now coming to the point, if I could, I think, Mr. Halderman, you're the one who's been making this. I was fascinated with your conversation about your ability to demonstrate a hacking of a system, and did so apparently pretty easy. If it's that easy, A, why haven't they done it? And the second question is, how can we dissuade them? Because that's something I've been advocating for a long time, not just in the electoral process, but just dissuading these cyber attacks with more aggressive repercussions from it. Thoughts on that?
I don't want to give the misimpression that it's something so easy that anyone could do, but I do think that manipulating election results at scale is something that's well within the reach of sophisticated nation states like Russia. Why haven't they done it yet? I think they haven't done it because they haven't seen it as in their interest yet to cause a disruption that severe to our electoral process. And that's what scares me, that it's not the technology that's preventing them or detecting them from causing wider scale manipulation. It's that there are limits to their interest.
A political calculation.
I believe so.
So if there are those of us who have been advocating for a long time that we should have greater repercussions for some of their cyber intrusions, again, Mr. Rosenbach, I think you had suggested this in your opening statements. What would you suggest that might be, and do you think it would be effective?
Yes, sir. I think we're on a path to doing that with taking more assertive actions. As reported in the Washington Post yesterday, that Cybercom cut off internet access for the organization that was responsible for this. I think there needs to be clear attribution, and people at the most senior levels of government need to say that this type of activity has happened, that there will be repercussions and sanctions, military action, other thing. The one thing that I think is different is the manipulation of social media is something on a scale and a depth that would not be able to take place before because of the technology. And the technology changing has made their ability to influence much different than it was in the past.
Well, thank you, and to the chairman, I wish I had another hour, but that would be unkind of me, but because it's an important conversation.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, and thank you so very much for all of the work that you do. I've read all of your testimony, and I'm very impressed with the work that you've done and the questions that my colleagues have already asked. I'd like to talk about, ask you to talk about not just the voting machines, which I think that you've adequately discussed that, but the relationship between the voter registration systems and voting on election day. So that the vulnerabilities of poll workers and polling places to verify that voters are actually registered or not registered, or registered at a particular precinct or not registered, which if certain demographic groups are eliminated or are wiped from the record, would be prevented from voting when they appear, and particularly if they're voters who have to rush back to work, who don't have time to do the added verification for provisional ballots. What is the implication in terms of the vulnerabilities of our voter registration systems? I think in Georgia, the Secretary of State's office has a database with all of the eligible registered voters, and the local county election boards have access to that through, I'm not sure if it's internet, but there's an electronic connection there. I think in Illinois, your department, your Illinois State Board of Elections, has a separate pipeline so that you don't run your data, election data, through the internet. You've developed a separate system which makes it more secure, but most states don't do that. So can you talk about how we secure that and the impact on national elections? The weakest link in that whole thing could very well determine the outcome in a close election. Can you just kind of discuss that, the three of you?
I'll try to address the importance of the link between voter registration systems and the actual voting on Election Day. And I think it's a critical link. Obviously, maintaining an accurate list of the registered voters is paramount to an efficient, well-run election. I think where the problem could occur is if a malicious actor were to mess with the database, whether it's wiping it out or manipulating it, it could cause, catastrophic problems on Election Day.
So, I mean, the research you've done, does it indicate that there are vulnerabilities for doing just that?
Well, I mean, our system is an example of a vulnerability. Now, the difference is in Illinois, we have a bottom-up system so that the voters are registered through the local election officials, and then their information is transmitted up into our database. So theoretically, they could wipe out our database, but elections would still go on because it's all done at the local level. If there was an intrusion into the local database, that's where you'd have a problem. And I think this is where the vulnerability is more acute in Illinois, is because the defenses that the local election officials have, in some cases, very little defense. Others, maybe larger counties, have perhaps a stronger defense, but I think there is where the vulnerability is. Now, in Illinois, you have same-day registration and you have provisional voting, so that, again, hypothetically, if a county's system was compromised, people would still be able to vote.
Let me ask Mr. Haldeman if he could, you've done some looking at the Georgia system in terms of voter registration, how it relates. What is your observation there?
Yes, well, Georgia is, I think, a good example of potential vulnerabilities. Shortly before the November election, there were a number of problems detected with the Georgia online voter registration system, including a simple attack whereby attackers could potentially manipulate voters' data. I think the key to securing voter registration is monitoring to make sure that attackers are not penetrating the database, coupled with resilience. Having mechanisms in place, especially at the polls, to make sure that if something goes wrong with the database or the e-poll books, that the election can continue. Including making having things like early voting take some pressure off of election day systems and could add to that resilience.
I think my time has just about expired, so I thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Out of the $380 million of the Help Americans Vote Act grants that were allocated in 2018, about 1/3 of the funds would be spent on cybersecurity, 1/3 would be spent on new voting equipment, and about 1/3 was supposed to be spent on voter registration systems and other state-specified activities. Mr. Sandvoss, when it comes to purchasing new voting equipment, improving cybersecurity, how long would you say it takes to fully implement these measures?
Well, in Illinois, we have a process where voting system vendors seek approval from the State Board of Elections to allow their machines to be in use in Illinois, and we put them through a rigorous test. They also have to go through federal testing as well. Our testing probably takes, depending on the size of the election that's being tested, it could take a couple weeks, it could take over a month. My understanding is some of the problems happened with the vote testing at the federal level, where there were some delays. It took a long time for voting machines to get the federal approval necessary to even come to the state. It's hard to put an actual beginning and end point to implementing these systems, I guess, or these qualifications for the voting system to actually be in use. Right now, we're still waiting for the voluntary voting system guidelines to be promulgated by the EAC. Once that's done, then voting machine manufacturers would need to test their systems to those standards. It's gonna take a long time, and I can't guarantee it'll be done by 2020.
Thank you. It's my understanding each state has until 2023, and it'll take most states at least 2 to 3 years to use the majority of these funds. I also understand the first progress report was due to the Election Assistance Commission only 2 months ago. Mr. Chairman, it would seem to me to be more effective to see the financial and progress reports to determine the effectiveness of each state's approach before moving forward in allocating additional funds.
I appreciate your thoughts on that. If you want me to interject or ask questions related to that, that's certainly up to you. It's your time.
Well, I was just making that point of order.
Oh, I appreciate that. And if I might, and certainly give you the time that you need. So the EAC is slowing the states down.
Well, it was just recently that the 2 new appointees were confirmed, and now the EAC has a quorum. So there was some delay, at least in getting the voting system standards out.
But your belief in operating on these programs on a daily basis is that training, equipment, software, and so forth is effective, and it protects your system. The fact that it may take longer than it should to implement all this doesn't deter your interest.
Oh, not at all.
I reclaim my time, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect. In 2018, Ohio used Help American Vote Act grant funds to host regional tabletop exercises for election officials. Mr. Rosenbach, these exercises were modeled after the crisis simulation organized by the Defending Digital Democracy Project. Can you provide more information on how these types of events prepare our election officials for our worst-case scenarios?
Yes, sir. Thank you for asking about that, and thank you for having the Ohio folks there. They did a great job and are real professionals. That's the project that I lead up at Harvard, and what we do is we simulate a Russian cyber attack against a state and local election infrastructure and help them rehearse how to prepare for that in terms of risk mitigation steps, technically and otherwise, how to respond to information attacks in the media and in the press and via social media, which is what often would happen with the Russians. And the reason we do that is along the lines of what Mr. Sanvo said, is it can take time to get new technical things in place, and we may not have that time. So we just want to rehearse, do like you do in the Army, where you exercise to failure, learn from that, then teach someone else to do it, and try to have all the election officials in Ohio do something and learn and get better.
What other proactive steps can local election officials take to ensure personnel are adequately prepared or trained for these type of scenarios?
Yeah, these are surprisingly basic things when it comes to cybersecurity. So it's making sure that they use the right type of password, making sure that they use encryption and two-factor authentication, that they have a plan for what to do if a hack occurs in terms of being resilient. As many of you said, this is all about trust. And even if the bad guys attack us and we do go down, if we're able to demonstrate to the public that we went down, we came back up, the vote is still viable, you can trust in it, then it also diminishes the Russians or the Iranians' desire to try to attack if they know it's not going to have any impact.
For my time as a county prosecutor, representing a board of elections, we went to this electronic system, or the egg, where you color the egg like old grade school tests and you put it in. We created a back door in the system so that the company, in case there was an issue, could come back into it, correct?
That will happen often. Backdoors are not good cybersecurity practice for encryption or anything else.
Going forward, is there a way to eliminate that, yet still allow the system to be operable, or have somebody be able to repair or malfunction during the vote without allowing something in?
Experience, there's nothing electronic that won't have a vulnerability, and that's 20 years working in the intelligence community as a former NSA person and cyber. But that's why you build in all these other risk mitigation factors into it, and why you do try to update technology, update software, address vulnerabilities so that you make it a lot harder.
So, and I don't mean to go too far over my time, I'm taking back some of the time that Mr. Chairman had used, but you really can't have a backdoor. You can't allow the manufacturer to be able to work on this equipment remotely without creating an opening.
Sir, I think backdoors are a big cybersecurity vulnerability. If it were up to me, there would be no closed proprietary software used on election voting systems, and we would have a national project in which we worked on an open source system that would be much cheaper for the states, much more transparent, and have far fewer vulnerabilities.
Did HAVA address any of those things?
How would it address that?
No, HAVA, or Help American Vote Act?
HAVA addresses it right now because it is replacing and updating old technology, which is full of holes that the bad guys can attack. I do think that's important, but I think we could find a
That
more.
program that's 50 separate programs, though, correct?
Yes, sir. We could find a more innovative and more cybersecurity-based way to do that that would not be based on the current vendor-based system right now.
I got it. Thank you, sir. I yield back
No,
my
I
time.
understand, and Mr. Joyce raises interesting points and important ones. And we're just talking about the states and locals, but the attack that we're talking about in Illinois was through a vendor, correct?
Actually, the attack in Illinois was not through a vendor. It was a direct attack into our system using the online voter registration website portal. It was an SQL injection.
But there was something related to the issue as it relates to a vendor who had supplied this or something? Is that some accurate point? I mean, there has to be, because we're using vendors toward these points, isn't that creating the vulnerabilities that we may not necessarily be alerted to?
That must have been one of the jurisdictions in Illinois that involved a vendor, maybe storing information on the cloud or something to that effect. I do recall that, but that didn't impact that wasn't the case in the attack on Illinois.
And we're going to get to Ms. Kirkpatrick in a second, but to let the other two gentlemen discuss that issue, if they could.
Well, attacks on vendor systems or on vendors' customer lists or attacks on vendors' supply chains could also compromise equipment used by states throughout the election process. So the vendors are a part of the problem. They can be part of a solution, too, because somebody does need to manufacture and service voting equipment, but we need better standards.
I would just say very quickly, the Russians, other national intel services regularly try to get in through vendors to attack the United States government. Department of Defense would do it in the election system. Cybersecurity is a cost center in the private sector. That means there are not huge incentives for vendors to devote a lot of investment in the cybersecurity of their machines and technology unless forced to do so via contract or otherwise.
Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Graves, for having this hearing. I agree with what Congressman Stewart said, that the election security is so important to our democracy. We've all talked with voters who believe their vote doesn't count, and we've seen voter turnout decrease as a result of that. In Arizona, we have early voting and we have vote by mail. And so my question to the panel is that a better system? Is that a more secure system, voting by mail and having early voting? And what kind of risks do you see in that system?
Early voting can reduce pressure on Election Day. That's very positive. It does complicate some of the technology, but we have ways administratively of dealing with those complications. One of the most important things is to make sure that early voting as well is based on a paper ballot the voter can verify that gets audited after the election. Vote by mail has pros and cons. On the pro side, it is on a paper ballot that can, at least in theory, be audited after the election. On the con side, unfortunately, voters are no longer voting within the safety of a polling place, and particularly for the weakest people in society, they could be at risk of being coerced or having their votes bought or stolen through the vote-by-mail process. So there are important trade-offs involved.
Yes, ma'am. I would just say very quickly, I'm a strong proponent of vote by mail and early voting. What Dr. Haldeman said, notwithstanding, if you just look at participation rates in states like Oregon and Washington State, they're significantly higher. That's good for democracy, and there are a lot of people who would not otherwise vote that will, from a cybersecurity perspective, also clear advantages.
I would have to agree with both of my colleagues on the points that they raised, especially the pros and cons. I think with mail-in voting, the obvious pro would be convenience for the voter and perhaps make it easier to do a random audit, a risk-limiting audit. On the flip side, we get complaints quite often of people who get sent applications, and then they said they didn't request them, although that's perfectly legal in Illinois, but it contributes to that general sense of distrust. It's also possible that without the security of voting in a polling place, there's no way to ensure that the voter is voting independently without coercion. Sometimes vote by mail can, or I should say, off-site voting. It's a problem in nursing homes in Illinois where you get an overzealous precinct captain who might, collect all the ballots and have improper influence the way they vote. So there's negatives too, but I can certainly see the positives from an economic standpoint and a convenience standpoint.
Same-day registration is becoming more and more popular. We don't have it yet in Arizona, but I'd like each of your opinions on same-day registration. Is that a more secure way to register and vote?
I would say that, again, with same-day registration, it's more like a fail-safe, that if as Mr. Bishop had brought up the point about manipulation of the voter registration rolls, if such a situation were to occur, same-day registration would at least allow the person to vote, which to me is the most important thing, and then you can, straighten out what happened afterwards. As far as security is concerned, I don't see necessarily from a technical standpoint that being an issue. There may be an issue, though, related to verifying who the person is. I mean, are they who they say they are? Because once they cast the ballot, then that's it. You can't take it back.
Other panelists, comments?
Same-day registration can take some of the pressure off of the polling place operations and the poll books. Once again, it can add resilience. It does also require more technical plumbing to make sure that that process can work, and it's important that we apply good cybersecurity thinking there. But I think the broader point is that election cybersecurity in general is a problem where we can make a lot of progress, and things like same-day registration can feed into improving that. But I think unlike so many other cyber challenges, Representative Kirkpatrick, this is a problem where we can actually solve the problem. It's going to take a little bit of money, but it's not going to be decades of research. It's not going to be billions of dollars. We have an opportunity for a cybersecurity win in election security.
Anyone disagree with that? Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is really a great discussion, and I think it's a good opportunity to compliment the states in navigating a very difficult and challenging process and keeping the integrity of the process as best as possible, because there's a lot of moving parts. I think every state's very, very different, and there's a lot of, I think we all know from our own elections, there's a lot of energy in the elections process from a constituency base and candidate base. But you could probably take this conversation broader, whether it was the IRS commissioner here or OPM or Treasury, any SEC chairman sitting before us. We'd probably have a very similar concern and conversation about what do we do with the cyber threats out there. And I think if you have brought up something that's fascinating, probably generally from gentlemen from Illinois, and that is, what do you do when you're a state that's being attacked? How do you respond to that? Who do you call? Who's going to be there to help? And that's probably the biggest question to answer, really, quite frankly, is how do we provide that support? Something I've been a strong advocate for and have introduced legislation to do this is to allow for active cyber defense. We're a very passive nation when it comes to cybersecurity, and that is we have to be impacted first, and then we can respond. And Mr. Rosenbach, I think you've sort of hinted at that, and the federal government is stepping into that lane a little bit, and I think we should enable states to do more of that, and the private sector as well, whether we're talking about IRS commissioner or states, our largest business in our district to the smallest business to the family. Who do they call when they're being impacted, or how can they respond? And the answer is everybody's vulnerable and left vulnerable. So, Mr. Chairman, as we go forward, I hope we could have a conversation, just you and I and Mr. Stewart and others, about can we equip and enable tools to be available to not only states or agencies or the private sector, but others to actively defend themselves in the cyber realm, because this is a new threat and concern for everybody. But this is a fascinating and great conversation. I appreciate all three panelists here.
And I want to give anyone a chance to ask a second round of questions, and I appreciate that, and I hope that as a committee we can talk about how HAVA was created, and Ms. Joyce, you were alluding to that, how this funding works. Right now it sets up, it allows the formula allows for consideration of voting age population, and one of the questions I want to get to is there a better way to do that based on need or some sort of competitive analysis on this, and analyzing how well it works to your point. So I appreciate that, Mr. Ranking Member. And I guess as we go back to the Democrats through a second round, I'd go to Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that we've heard multiple times today is, this question is, are you aware of any outcome that was changed in any American election because of outside interference or hacking or things like that? That's a little different from the question I would ask. The question I would ask would be, has any American election result been changed, whether we're aware of it or not? And so you think, well, we've been going back and forth about this lack of audit trails. How do we know? I mean, there are a lot of close elections that we don't have audit trails for. Do we know for sure? Mr. Rosenbach?
We may not know for sure, but this is what my gut tells me. Working on this stuff for 20 years, watching the Russians, doing a lot of intel stuff, doing intel oversight, is what the Russians did is probably a very small part that we know of. What we know of is a very small part of what they probably actually did. Anytime the Russians have hacked something, including the Department of Defense, we find one small thing and only later unravel the greater part. So while we don't know that definitively, and that's important to say, I don't think we should take solace in that as a fact. They are very good, they're very aggressive, and they're probably doing something right now and may even be in the infrastructure we have, just like they're in the energy grid and in parts of the financial structure as well.
Well, along those lines, yes, the Russians are smart and they're aggressive, and they're also really subtle. So they know if they're going to bollocks up one of our elections, in a big way, it's going to cause a big uproar in this country and really attune everybody that this is an attack on our national sovereignty by a foreign power. They're not that dumb. They're going to do subtle things. What's your take, Dr. Haldeman?
I agree with you that they're going to strike when it's in their interest to strike, and unfortunately, our technology is not yet there to stop them. I think 2020 is going to be the bigger prize. It's not surprising that 2018 was relatively quiet because, as you say, the attackers don't want to induce an immune response almost that's going to make it harder for them to strike when they really want to later. But the unfortunate truth is that although there is no evidence that votes have been changed through a cyber attack in this country, there are many places that just are not being checked because there are not audits in place. There's not a paper trail in place. And if you go and ask, DHS, for instance, how many voting machines they brought into a laboratory and did forensics on to make sure that there was no malicious software inside, I'm pretty sure the answer is going to be 0. So there's a lot more that we could be doing to look for evidence of an attack.
Sandvoss?
Yeah, as far as the question of, has there been an election that the results have changed and we didn't know about it? Obviously, we don't have any evidence of that here in Illinois. I'm not saying that it isn't possible. It certainly is. We do have procedures in place to try to prevent that. We have a pre-election test, a public test, a post-election test. Our agency selects at random jurisdictions to be tested. The voting equipment is tested, so there is, some assurance that we can give that the election results are legitimate. But there's other factors that are beyond our control, and that is what at least there's some evidence of is manipulation through platforms such as social media, which one could argue the extent that it affects an election, but when you have fake accounts hitting on hot button issues that might influence somebody whether to vote or not, that can have a subtle effect on an election, and those are harder to defend against. And the State Board of Elections can't order or establish security procedures by the social media, major social media companies. That probably would take some sort of federal legislation.
Well, I thank you for all of your testimony today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the point I was trying to make initially was that we're creating 50 separate units, and we've yet to hear from the last grants that were issued what the solutions were or potential solutions. So before I'm all for admit there's a problem, but before we advocate for more money, we should certainly make sure that we're addressing the problems that exist. And to that extent, in 2016, as I understand, one of the problems we had was the open lines of communication were lacking between the Department of Homeland Security and state election officials. As a result, they were unprepared to respond to detected suspicious activity in a timely manner. And I open this up to all of you. What efforts were made leading into the 2018 election to improve visibility and open lines of communication to state and local officials?
I'll just say very briefly, I think in 2016, there clearly was a problem of communication between DHS and the states on this issue. And I have to give credit to the Department of Homeland Security in the last several years really has done a good job to double down on that effort, open lines of communication, pass information, give secretaries of state security clearances. I think all of those things are very positive, and it's that role that the Department of Homeland Security should have that has gotten much better too. But I think Mr. Sandos can probably Sandvoss can give a better answer on that part too.
I would say that the Department of Homeland Security, by its own admission, came up a little short prior to the 2016 elections with respect to communication. I think since then, maybe it was a wake-up call, I don't know, but I think their efforts have certainly improved. I've been a part of 2 security briefings that I thought were worthwhile. They offer all sorts of assistance, free assistance to jurisdictions that they need to take advantage of. I guess if there's one area that we'd like perhaps to see a little more would be on-the-ground recovery assistance in the event of a cyber instance. Have boots on the ground, so to speak, to respond immediately. I know there's 50 states that probably are going to be wanting that kind of assistance, so I could see that being problematic. But
in that light, what should the EAC be doing to prepare for the 2020 election when you're back into a presidential year and you'll have a larger volume of voters?
Well, I think one of the things they might consider doing is kind of what we did in Illinois with our Cyber Navigator program, have actual cyber navigators ready to go to respond to cyber instances. Have some a team assigned to each state. And just a suggestion, but I know that when we've requested help, they're very good at offering assistance, but a lot of times they'll evaluate that. And we're expecting a CERT team to come in, and they'll say, well, it probably could be better handled by you folks in Illinois as opposed to sending in a federal team of cyber navigators to address a problem. And it could be just lack of resources. It could be other things that I don't know about. I'm just, my IT department, tells me that that's probably the one area that they could use a little more assistance. And not that the DHS is not doing a good job. I think they are, and they've come a long way. But we all can improve.
See, Dr. Halderman is chomping at the bit to address this. So,
well, let me just briefly say that I think DHS has been a big help in providing advice and guidance to states. They've come a long way since 2016. But I just want to emphasize that in states that don't yet have equipment with a paper trail in place, there's no amount of DHS assistance that's going to bring those states up to a reasonable level of security. You're just putting lipstick on a pig.
Well, that is a very good point. Then why have them? Unless you have a secondary trail to audit, why have them?
Why have, excuse me?
Why have a single system? If you don't have a paper trail or you don't have something to have your check and balance on, then why would you have a one-source system like that?
A one-source system. Well, there are states that haven't replaced out-of-date systems that don't have a paper trail, and there's no good reason today in 2019 to have a system that doesn't use paper ballots.
Well, the optical scanners we use with the old circle egg thing, at least at the end of the day, you have the machine and you have a paper ballot to match against. I mean, I don't know why we'd invest any money or allow a state to invest money in a system that just doesn't work. You're saying that they haven't been upgraded from the beginning.
That's right. There's states that haven't upgraded those machines from the beginning. Years ago, we didn't understand, or at least the broader community around elections didn't have the standards or the data or the experience to understand how risky it would be to use paperless voting systems. But now, with nation-state attacks being something you read about in the newspaper every week, well, we know better than that. But states need resources. They need to act to replace that equipment.
Thank you. Go ahead. You were leaning forward. We'll take it. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm still concerned about a national standard. It seems to me that if every state, you got 50 states deciding to use whatever system they deem appropriate, and if there are some vulnerabilities, as perhaps in Georgia in 2016, where or 2018, or 2018, where there was some indication from Homeland Security and FBI that our systems were being targeted, but the elections officials rejected the scrutiny, so that we really don't know if it occurred, and the help from a robust backup system from the federal government was rebuffed. So we really don't know. Don't you think that we need to have a national system that's standardized, in spite of the fact that there might be some concerns about overreach, so that, for example, if every state had a system similar to what Illinois has employed, and as I understand, you're not completely, you haven't done that with all of your election authorities. You've really experimented with it. You've done only partial, a third, or maybe half of them?
Actually, currently we have 94 out of our 108 are participating in the program.
Which means that, and let me ask all three of you, if every state had a system similar to the one implemented in Illinois, would that make for a more secure, a better outcome for our nation as a whole, particularly with our national elections?
If every state had a system that had hand-marked paper ballots, optical scanners, and manual risk-limiting audits, we'd be quite well protected. And I think voters could have confidence that any attack on the voting and tabulation process would be detected and correctable. I think we do need stronger minimum standards for election technology and election auditing, just to make sure that we can bring up the states that are most weakly protected to a reasonable level. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge and bear in mind that there are important differences between states, and that being overly prescriptive just isn't going to work. But that core outline of a recipe, having paper ballots and having audits to a high level of confidence, is something that every state can do. And making sure that states have the resources to do it is the new challenge.
Congress should mandate those minimum standards?
I do. I think it's important to make sure that the most weakly protected states are not going to cause a risk for the entire nation.
Mr. Rohrbach?
Yes, sir. I in my experience, have found it very difficult for Congress to mandate certain types of minimum standards. I think in general with cybersecurity, those standards tend to change pretty quickly. And it will be more often effective if you have a risk framework that they should follow that may be tied to funding so that they move forward that way.
Is a risk framework still
I think that's a
minimum
very
standard?
basic place to, yes, that's a very basic place to start that I think would be appropriate. In terms of a specific system, and maybe I'm misunderstanding you, that could be more difficult because, as you know, in the history of the U.S., it's very hard for the government to pick winners. What I think would be a different approach is that we have a national project to develop an open source software platform that's transparent and results in a paper-based audit that's not based on profit. I'm all for people making money,
Could we mandate that?
I think you could mandate the development of something like that. You probably could mandate, and there'd be to the states to figure out how to implement and how to use as it should be. It should be a state-led.
Could Congress mandate it? Absolutely. As a director of the election board in Illinois, I'm always a little leery of federal mandates, especially when they don't come with federal funds.
Yeah.
Exactly, yes.
Because we're in a position to provide the funds.
And believe me, that's one of the reasons I'm here is to to request them. But
That's what we're supposed to be doing.
I agree.
But we want to make sure that the funds that we provide will be effectively used to get the desired results.
Yeah, and I think the verdict is still out on that. I strongly believe that our Cyber Navigator program, if funded, is going to be successful. I guess we'll know better after the 2020 elections, crossing my fingers, that we don't suffer any incidences.
If I may just say, in the absence of stronger federal standards, if there are more funds provided, I think it's really important to make sure that they're not wasted. And I note that many states do not have any rules that say counties and localities can't turn around and use those federal dollars to buy more obsolete and vulnerable machines. That would just be a setback. So absence of greater standards, just saying you've got to have a paper ballot.
So you got to have standards.
Mr. Bishop, could you yield to me just for a moment, just for a follow-up?
I will yield.
Yeah, thank you. My understanding is the Elections Assistance Commission has guidelines, or would you consider those the types of mandates or guidelines that the gentleman's requesting? And if so, I understand they're behind a little bit and the money is available, but how do you match up with guidelines that haven't been developed yet? And maybe that'll address a little bit of what he's asking there.
Reclaiming my time.
Thank you, Jim.
Also, are those guidelines adequate?
Yes, so the EAC does create under HAVA what are known as the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines, and those are in the process of being updated and modernized. They haven't yet been updated and modernized, unfortunately. In any case, they're voluntary on the states and relatively weak in their scope. They won't cover processes like post-election audits that are a critical component of running a holistically secured election system. So we need to do more to develop those standards, but in the meantime, just the high-level bullet in any kind of standard is going to be, you've got to have a paper ballot that we can go back and audit.
Let's move on. Thank you, sir. Mr. Christ.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. As a Floridian and a former governor, I know a little bit about contested elections. In fact, as governor, I made sure that all ballots did in fact have a paper trail so that we had something to verify against what we're being told by the electronic machines. I applaud and support any and all efforts to shore up our election security, especially through Help America Votes grants. And Mr. Sandoval, I would inquire, my home state of Florida was awarded $19 million in election security grants. The state then added an additional mandate that any funds unspent by supervisors of elections at the end of the 2018 cycle were to be returned to the Florida Department of State basically use it or lose it, if you will. Do you know of any other states that made such an addendum, and would you recommend it?
I'm not aware of any other states that have made that, and no, I would not recommend that. In Illinois, for instance, it's the grant is over a 5-year period, and to force the state through its local election officials to spend it quickly as opposed to wisely, I think would be the wrong way to go. We're going to spend probably about $1.2 million of our grant. But again, we want to keep our Cyber Navigator program running, and we need funds also to be available to, depending on what they discover through their audits and their assessments. That takes time. So that would be my opinion on that.
Thank you. Can you think of a reason why a state would add on such a mandate?
Offhand, I cannot.
Neither can I. To any of you, what do you think is the greatest security threat to the 2020 election cycle?
I'll start, sir. I think the cyber aspect is very important, but honestly, I'm more concerned about a disinformation campaign via the social media platforms that undermines trust and confidence in the elections when maybe there has not even been a successful cyber attack. And that's where there still is a huge vulnerability. The social media companies have very grudgingly made very little progress on addressing threats to their platforms. And just the idea that the Russian GRU could spread disinfo about a hack in a state that had not even occurred, a polling place being closed, those type of things could lead to distrust in our country that could be, I think, very undermining of trust.
So inappropriate propaganda.
Yes, sir, all kinds of propaganda, highly targeted, just like they started to do in the past, continue to do, and certainly will do.
I agree with Mr. Rosenbach that social media and disinformation is a big worry, and it's a worry that's compounded because the social media companies have yet to make much of their data available to researchers on the outside who are trying to study cybersecurity and make things stronger. But again, what keeps me up at night is not the things that we're going to see, like attacks in social media, but the things that might happen that we probably won't see if they happen, which could include attacks that tamper with election results. It's one thing for voters to lose confidence because people are telling them lies, but in fact, we cannot tell voters that we are confident that no votes will be changed in future elections until we have the election infrastructure secured to a level where it has resilience and auditability.
What's required to do that?
New equipment that is going to be using hand-marked paper ballots and optical scanning, and rigorous post-election audits implemented by the states. We're starting to make some progress there, but there's a long way to go.
Thank you.
And I would just have to say that I agree with both my colleagues as to the threat that was outlined. Misinformation is out there, and I think it does have a negative effect on voter attitudes, and it does or could have the potential for influencing an election. And by the same token, I think that the voting equipment vulnerabilities that were mentioned earlier, that's a legitimate concern as well. And it might not necessarily just be a situation of a hacker. It could be the machines themselves are old and they malfunction. And if it happens, on election day, a series of machines go down and you don't have anything to replace it, then you got problems.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for being here today. Lessons learned from the 2016, obviously you've talked extensively about that. Unfortunately, I was not here for some of that testimony, so I apologize in advance if I ask some of the same questions. I agree the federal government has to have minimum standards, and we have to have a basic recipe that our states should follow. In 2016, I know that several states refused federal assistance just to simply scan systems for checks, to check if they had been compromised in any way. My state of California did not. You know, they welcomed the federal government and allowed them to scrub and do some of that. How can we work together, understanding that while the state of California is this big, other states may not be, you know, that big, so the requirements for them may not be the same, the threshold that they should be meeting may not be the same, but we have to have minimum standards, and we have to have funding, I agree, to go with that, to avoid potential issues that come across. I know that in California, the database was looked at. There were questions whether if your voter registration was changed. But I could go online and check if I'm still a Democrat, and I was still a Democrat, so I was happy about that. I was still registered in my own home, but that was another concern. So how do we ensure that not just we're protecting, you know, the vote, but we're also protecting the registration?
Well, I can speak for my state, and we invited the DHS to come in and perform a risk and vulnerability assessment. I think it was worthwhile. How do states know if they have vulnerability if it's never been tested? That makes perfect sense to me. As far as the cooperation that you spoke of, again, I think that there's been a great improvement in the communication between the states and the federal agencies that, you know, the EAC, the DHS, and I'd like to obviously see that continue. As far as having mandatory standards, I can see merit in that, especially with respect to basic security and perhaps some sort of auditing requirement as well. I'd like to give that a little bit more thought, and I don't want to speak on behalf of my board on something like that because they probably have some ideas as well. But the standards, I guess, the devil's in the details. What exactly those standards would be, what would be the consequences for not following them? Would it be incentive-based, or would it be just a flat mandate? Those are questions that probably need to be asked before going forward.
I prefer incentive-based, but I would also like to, you know, see what do those minimum standards look like? What should they look like?
Yeah, and that's probably beyond my capacity because I'm not a tech person, so I couldn't, you know, give you a specific example of what those minimum standards should be. I just know, just in general, you know, the systems need to be as protected against manipulation as possible, and if it involves the risk limiting audit that Dr. Halderman here is advocating, you know, maybe that's the way to go. I've heard a lot of merit to that suggestion. I know in Illinois we'd have to have legislation to implement it, and we might see that.
So standards can accomplish a lot of things, and one of the things that they might accomplish is greater normalization between states that have some of the better election practices and states that are a little bit farther behind. I just want to offer one example of that. Representative Torres, in 2007, your state, California, brought in election experts and cybersecurity experts from across the country to do a thorough review of the computer code for all of the voting machines used in the state, and I took part in that. And we found, we documented about 1,000 pages of severe vulnerabilities, and that's all published on the Secretary of State's website. Even today, there are many states that use the same voting equipment that have not updated the software since before California's study. So nation-state attackers don't have to invent new vulnerabilities. They just have to go read about them on the California website in order to figure out where to strike. And that's why we need, there's a role for the federal government to make sure that we bring up the bottom of the playing field here and keep everyone protected.
My time's up, so I yield back.
No, I appreciate that. Mr. Graves, anything else? I want to thank those who have participated. That was excellent. We have a lot of work to do. We appreciate your assistance today, the work that you will do on an ongoing basis, and we look forward to working with you as we move forward. So thanks to everyone. This meeting is adjourned.